Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Joining us as always, the Prince of Twitter, the Regent of RedState.com, Andrew Malcolm at AH Malcolm on the Twitters, and of course he's over at RedState.com with a couple of VIP columns and a freebie column that you've got to read. It's one of his memories series, and he's doing such a great job of basically giving out his memoir for free. And
yeah, that's right.
We appreciate that, Andrew.
Well, I enjoy. I have always enjoyed telling stories. I dominated show and tell in the 6th grade.
Well, there you go. And you're always the highlight of every discussion that we're both part of. So you have a real talent for storytelling, and it's a good thing that you're a journalist.
Thank you. I think there's a connection, and I'm not sure.
There might be. I'm going to check into that. I'm putting that on my list of things to look into.
I'm always asking questions. I mean, it's just who I am, even though I'm not doing a story, but it's like I'm doing a story. So when my wife introduces me to somebody new, she says, "This is my husband, Andrew. He asks a lot of questions."
So I think, yeah, you fell into the journalism thing because that's your natural gift. I think I might be a natural podcaster because my wife and my mother were complaining the other day. When they hear this podcast, they're going to laugh. I sing in the church choir, and they commented to me on Saturday, "Why are you always the last one to leave the choir area?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And they answered the question for me. It's because you like to talk. And and I do. I love to talk.
What do you do? I know, and you're so good at it. That's why all those other radio stations ask you to fill in.
Yeah, much to their chagrin.
Oh, I don't think so.
So, you got a couple of good stories up. Want to get to those, especially the one about the Titanic. And I think Andrew might be checking to see what my tweet said, because I was joking around on my on the tweet that I sent out about this. Before we get to that, though, we've got to talk about NPR, because you and I talk about the media bias space a lot, right?
Yeah.
And how media has really gotten corrupted, especially in the last few decades. The Free Press, which is a really good platform launched by Barry Weiss and her wife, Nellie Bowles, because I got that wrong in a podcast last week. I said Susie Weiss. Susie Weiss is Barry's sister. Nellie Bowles is Barry's wife. Launched the Free Press, and they all three write for them too. And but they have a lot of other people that contribute, one of whom was a longtime NPR reporter / I think host. I'm not sure if he had his own show on there. Yuri Berliner, and I think I'm pronouncing that correct. It's either Uri or Yuri Berliner, and he exposed how much NPR changed after 2016. Now, I had a lot of issues with this timeline, I will say that, but I do also think that he was at least coming clean about what it is, what's NPR's been doing and just how corrupt they are. And NPR's CEO, Kathleen Maher, I think is her name, decided that she was going to set the record straight, Andrew, and put out a statement that said, "This is ridiculous. Of course we report. This is what we do. We report. We're giving people the truth, and really just ignoring everything that Berliner actually said. All the things that he actually, the fact that NPR blatantly said that they would not report on the Hunter Biden laptop story because they didn't want to waste the reader's time. I mean, you can't deny that. NPR actually said they weren't going to cover this story. It turned out to be true. So, what was your thought on the NPR reaction to this? I think we might have touched a little bit on the Berliner essay the last time we were talking.
Well, they're kind of prisoners of their own device. they are totally biased. There was a time long, long ago when they were highly respected by many people, but like so much of the rest of the media, they slid into a standard narrative, and it's obviously liberal. And they can do that. Liberal talk shows don't really work. I asked Al Franken about that, but the problem is that NPR gets federal funding, so all of us are chipping in. People can send in money to the stations. I know people who do that, or to NPR.
Right.
But sending taxpayers money who don't have a say in that simply because they can, Democrat government can do it. It's there's back channels to do it, and that's how they do it. But it's not fair, Marco Rubio told a very telling story to me once a few years ago. He said, he teaches part-time, or he did part-time at a community college in Miami.
Right.
And he was in the class, he was discussing with the students the problem that Uber and Lyft were having, because the city was putting all kinds of hurdles in front of them, and expensive hurdles, to help the taxi industry. The taxi industry didn't want competition. And they described it, and the class talked about it. And one of the students said to Rubio, gee, that doesn't really seem fair. And Rubio said, welcome to the conservative movement.
Yes. Yeah.
That's how government deals.
Yeah. Minneapolis just did that with Uber and Lyft. They basically force them to pay a far higher price per mile than is necessary. And so Uber and Lyft won't work in Minneapolis any longer. And I have a sneaking suspicion that the people who used to use Uber and Lyft in Minneapolis are going to be a little miffed about the fact that they're now stuck with the only somewhat responsive taxi service, because they don't issue too many medallions in Minneapolis for that. But I mean, I want to read to you that.
But you know what? They'll reelect that government.
Oh,
anyway,
yeah. They're nuts. They're absolutely nuts in Minneapolis. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. They're getting the government they deserve. H.L. Mencken once said, democracy is voters getting the government they deserve, good and hard. I'm paraphrasing. The good and hard.
I love that.
Well, the good and hard part is a quote, right?
That's one reason I'm not living in California anymore.
Yeah, well, I'm not living in Minnesota anymore. That is one reason, although it wasn't the primary reason. I mean, it was time to go. It was Catherine Maher. I just want to make sure I get the right name. It was Catherine Maher. And this is kind of what I wanted you to react to. Let me read you. And this is from, what was it? It was over the weekend, I think. It was Friday afternoon when they put this statement out in response to Berliner. And this was like a couple of days late, too. I mean, it took them a couple of days to come up with a response to this. And then this is what Catherine Maher, who is the non-journalist CEO, they hired her. We're going to get to that in a second, too. Even though she doesn't really have any journalistic background, they hired her to run the place. So this is one of the pull quotes from an NPR reporter who was tweeting out portions of this statement. And this is the quote: questioning whether our people are serving our mission with integrity based on little more than the recognition of their identity is profoundly disrespectful, hurtful, and demeaning. Yeah, but is it true? First off, doesn't even address that, whether it's true. In the second place, what are we, in the fourth grade? Big boys and girls get criticized for their work. And to say that, oh, it's hurtful, disrespectful, and demeaning to have to answer criticism over our work is, I'm sorry, grade school stuff.
Yeah, it is. And it shows she's not in journalism and she's not online. It's not the kind of response.
Oh, she's online. Oh,
Yeah,
she's
but
online. We'll get to
I
that.
know. Yeah, I know that, but I mean, she's not experienced. She doesn't know how to deal with it because it's not like you say. It's not an apt. It's not an effective response.
Right.
Uh, you got to. There is a lingo to Twitter and social media, but there's also a rhythm to it, and something you do, some things you do, and some things you don't. And she did all the, as you said, grade school stuff to dodge around it. And this is why this is the problem with media that you listen to or watch.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
it's not in front of you to verify in your own mind. You hear something, it's gone, poof. And if you have it in print or on your screen, you can go, wait a minute, I can check that, but you can't. And that's the world that she lives in. And she's got to support the people. I mean, she couldn't come out and be honest about it because they are not honest about it.
Yeah. And I mean, again, this doesn't even actually address the very specific stories and cases that Berliner
Exactly.
brought. Not only that, but I mean, there's also this, and I want to get to this too. It is deeply simplistic to assert that the diversity of America can be reduced to any particular set of beliefs, and faulty reasoning to have inferred that identity is determinative of one's thoughts or political leanings. Berliner was quoting from memos in NPR that basically declared that they were going to report everything through the prism of identity, which is one of the things that Berliner was objecting to in this thing. And I believe it was John Lansing who wrote the memo. This is before Maher came on as CEO. But I mean, Berliner's actually producing the receipts, right? You know, he's saying this is what we were told. And by the way, this is what, you know, the Writers Guild or whatever it is at the NPR is basically enforcing as well. The reason why it works so well at NPR is because everybody here is on board with that type of framing of every single story. And I mean, Maher's like, did she even read what Berliner had wrote? I'm not even sure that she did that much.
And I'm not sure she actually wrote what she said she wrote.
Well,
that sounds like a hack doing it for PR hack. And I say hack in a respectful way. Someone who's hired to help people get a message out or drown them.
Flack might be a little bit more nicer term for that, but hack, I think, in this particular case, I think hack actually applies.
Yeah. Having been a flack, I try to be careful about it. I mean, he's got the evidence, and this is the problem when you have traders, as far as NPR is concerned, come out with the outside stuff, and this is actually what Barry Weiss did. And what I think his name was Adam Rothstein, who was an assistant of Barry Weiss's, he wrote his tell-all in was it the Economist or the Atlantic?
The Atlantic. He wrote it at the Atlantic. Yes.
Yeah, and right, and it was the editorial page editor who wrote in the Economist about what was really happening, and Rothstein's opening anecdote about working with Barry Weiss at the New York Times and on the editorial page was telling. And just briefly, there was an HR orientation session, and everybody in the session, including Rothstein, was supposed to say something they liked, and he was kind of flustered, and he said, "I love Chick-fil-A chicken sandwiches."
Yep.
And the moderator said, "Oh, we don't do that here because they're anti-gay." Now, I mean, that's orientation. This is the indoctrination of new employees for what we do and don't say. Now, I saw, and I share it with you the other day, the New York Times is doing, this is not NPR, but the New York Times is doing an internal review, which I hope does something. I'm not totally confident, but the relatively new executive editor trying to get control of the staff back and what you can and cannot say on Slack, which Slack is the internal email channel or mechanism that employed liberals there had used to enforce their policy and actually to get Barry Weiss fired and Adam Rothstein and Barnett. Was it Barnett or Barrett? Oh,
Barrett. James Bennett.
Bennett. Yeah, he's the senator's brother from Colorado. So
I did not know that. Actually, maybe I did at one point. I didn't remember that.
Bennett with one T. Yeah.
Bennett with T. That's right. Yeah. Okay.
So now he's, I guess, back at The Economist, which is a great place. I mean, I'm sure it has its own agenda. I can't afford to read it, but it's but the whole world that they live in, it's like, who was it? Was it an editor or somebody told me a long time ago? He said, well, that in the media, it's like asking a goldfish, what does the water taste like? It's all the goldfish knows.
You're right. You're right. Exactly. Right.
But it's not connected with the Titanic.
No. And one other quick media story. I got to get your reaction. We'll just do it quickly before we get to your Titanic story, because we got to talk about that. Sure. The Daily Beast, IAC, which owns the Daily Beast, is apparently bringing in new executives to run the place. They're going to have a new publisher, and they're going to have a new executive editor. The publisher is going to come from Disney's TV group, and the editor or chief content and creative officer that's coming over from Cosmopolitan. And this was the statement from IAC, I guess, or from Joanna Coles, who's coming over from Cosmo. Says that the new team would be, quote, bringing the beast back to its rebel roots. If you're going to have rebel roots in the media, do you go to Disney and Cosmo for rebels? Because to me, Disney's sort of the Death Star. and Cosmo is the style, is the fashion.
So Cosmo designed the uniforms of the people on the Death Star.
Right. They're the stormtrooper. They're the ones that designed the stormtrooper uniforms, and 10 ways you can tell your lover can tell each stormtrooper apart from one another, sort of thing. I mean, these guys are not rebels, right? I mean, this is the same thing as hiring Catherine Marr to to run NPR. This is just the establishment playing musical chairs around the mainstream media. Right. And there are people at the Daily Beast I like. I'm not criticizing the Daily Beast per se, but the idea that, first off, Barry Diller was one of the people who helped found the Daily Beast. So we're not talking about some sort of anti-establishment sort of thing going on at the Daily Beast. They do some.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
But to call, to say we're going to go back to rebel roots, which they didn't have, by hiring executives from Disney and Cosmo. I mean, come on, man. Now you're just pissing on my head and tell me it's rain. I mean, that's really what that is, right?
Yeah. I don't expect to see manifestos coming out.
No. And like I said, they do some good work, and I know a couple of people over there. They're good people at the Daily Beast. That's not really my point. But to say that the Daily Beast is some sort of rebel publication is nonsense. They're very firmly in the same camp as the rest of the mainstream media. If you wanted to hire somebody to introduce some element of rebellion at the Daily Beast, I'd suggest hiring somebody from the Blaze or from the Daily Wire.
Yeah.
Those are the anti-establishment people. Those are the rebels. All right. Now we got to get to the Titanic, because I always love your posts about your journalistic career, and I love talking with you about Final Harvest, the book that you wrote in 1986.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Had a great episode on that. This was really touching, in a way that I think the movie Titanic tried to be. You know, Titanic was a good movie. I'm not going to denigrate it, but emotionally, I just felt it was manipulative. Right? This isn't. This is a real story of something that happened on the Titanic, and you got a chance. Not that you were there when it sunk. Maybe.
No, I missed that. I missed that sailing.
But you were there when one of the people who survived passed, and it was a really interesting story. And I was curious as I was reading this is how you got onto that story in the first place, because
that's interesting. Well, I I was on the New York Times, and I started there in '67, and I became a reporter in '69, and I spent a couple of years in purgatory on the metropolitan staff, and then I was freed to join the national and foreign staffs. And since I was so new, I was always the junior guy, and in the news bureaus. So the boss would get the big stories, and I would get, well, the news leftovers if I wanted to do them. But I decided that I wanted to go out and find my own stories that were distinctive and different and tell them in my way. I love telling stories and tales. So over the years, I was doing that, and I got a reputation for it. And one day, I got a call from the Coast Guard that said, this is in 1982, said, we've noticed your stories on the offbeat and the unusual human interest stories, and we think we have one you might be interested in. And the short version, because I don't want to spoil all the details, but the short version is that when the Titanic was sinking, they didn't have anywhere near enough lifeboats because it was unsinkable. They knew it was unsinkable. And a lot of the early lifeboats were launched only partly full. But one of the last lifeboats had Emily Goldsmith and her son Frankie, and they were going to get on it. And they were on the deck. The ship was tilting towards the bow and the right side, which is where it scraped the iceberg. And it was women and children first. So Frank Goldsmith, who was a British laborer who had saved up $30 to take his family to the New World, where he heard there were a lot of jobs. So he was on the deck with them, and he hugged his wife, and then he leaned down and he took Frankie's shoulders. He was 4 years old, and he said, "So long, Frankie, I'll see you later." And they got in the boat, and a few minutes later, it went under. And they got in the lifeboat, and a few minutes later, the Titanic went under, and the mother covered her son's eyes so he didn't see it, but he never forgot, "See you later." And he went on and lived his life, and I have details about what he did in his life, and retired in Florida. And every year about this time, he would get sad and morose. And they lived near, I guess, the Tigers ball field in Detroit for a while. And whenever he'd hear the fans cheering, he would freeze because he'd hear the screaming coming down the street. I guess reminded him of the 1,500 that died in the freezing water. So for a long time, he was sad every April. And then he happened to tell his story of that night and his memory to, I think it was a Rotary Club who heard he was a survivor. And the word got out, and every April he would do a whole bunch of radio interviews and so on. And it kind of reliving the moment, although you'd think it would be sad, and it was sad, lifted the burden of sadness, and talking about it apparently made him feel better. So in January of '82, he got an invitation to speak to the big stage, to the Titanic Society, their annual convention, which comes in April.
Right.
And his wife went to bed, and then she had a funny feeling. She came out, and he was dead on the couch. But she remembered his story, or his wish, for a long, long time. He wanted to live up to "See You Later" for Frankie, and he wanted to go back and be buried, or his ashes, where the Titanic was. So she spent weeks making the arrangements with a lot of kind people. And every April on this day, well, we're talking on Monday, the 15th, but this is the 15th, right? Yeah.
It's
Every
15.
day, every day on the 15th, the Coast Guard flies over the Titanic and it throws out a wreath in memory. And the Coast Guard flies out of Newfoundland because it's on the U.S. contributes to a iceberg patrol, although they have radar now. But
Right.
to track the icebergs and warning the shipping, which is huge in the North Atlantic. These things weigh millions of tons. These icebergs that fall off of Greenland and then drift down into the Gulf Stream and melt away. So the plane goes out on its patrol. Well, I went along with them, and it was a big plane where the back goes down, and I guess they don't, not at the Titanic, but I guess the Coast Guard has a kind of a semi-secret policy that people who are nice and sometimes get their ashes on a Coast Guard boat, and they will spread them on the water for the family. But this was unusual because it was the Titanic. So the back came down, and we were all tethered on a strap so we didn't get blown out, because everything that was loose in there just got sucked right out the back. Huge wind. We were 1,000 feet above the North Atlantic. You could see white caps through these wispy clouds. And the petty officer threw the wreath out, and then he had this little box, and he opened it up. It was Frankie Goldsmith, tipped it over, and about 2 or 3 handfuls of granular ashes went out and drifted down for however long, so that Frankie would be back with his father. It was a very moving story. I must say my editors weren't as moved as I was. But
kind of hard-nosed journalistic editor.
Right. Yeah. Well, what's it going to do to the revolution in Africa? Nothing, absolutely nothing. But it will be a sweet roll for readers in the morning. Anyway, they did publish all my story, so I'm thankful for that. And so I wrote about it. And at the time, and this will be another memory in the future, at the time I had a hobby. My father taught me. I put 2 business cards in a plastic Diet Pepsi bottle, and I threw that out too at the Titanic site. And I'll talk about that later, but I mean on another episode. But it was a very moving and very human experience. So we flew back. We were about 400 miles off of Newfoundland. We flew back to Newfoundland. When we landed, I called Emily, or not Emily, I called Victoria, Frankie's wife in Florida, and described the day in great detail. And she was very moved. I think she was crying. And she had some sweet thoughts about him that I put in the post. So that story stuck. I don't want to say haunted because that's bad, but it stayed in my memory for a long time. And this year, since I'm doing all these memories, 15 of them now for Red State, Jennifer Van Laar suggested it because I was, as a storyteller, I would tell them to them, and they would say, "Oh, you should write that," and I would say, "That's 40 years ago. Who cares?" But apparently, judging by the page views today, a lot of people care. So it's fun to write. It's fun to share those moments, and especially when they're human ones. And the links to all the memories are there at the bottom of this post, and it's open. It's not in the paywall, so everybody can see it there. There's a picture actually of Frankie, his dad, and his mom. And his little sister who died of diphtheria before the ship sailed.
Well, let me ask you this, because it's a beautiful story. I mean, it really is. It's an absolutely beautiful story. Very well told. Of course, nobody's going to be surprised to hear that, because you're Andrew Malcolm, after all,
The prince. Yeah,
the
right.
prince of Twitter, and the jester of journalism. No, that doesn't.
Yeah, no.
Not the Joker
Reason,
of
the
journalism.
reason.
That isn't going to work either. We're not going to do. We're not doing that. But it's what do you think it is that makes those types of stories as popular as they become? Because I think it's pretty clear that these things do
Yeah.
become popular.
Yeah,
And there's a reason for it.
there is a very strong reason for it. And it's a reason that I tried to mine for I was on the New York Times for 26 years, and I've been doing similar things ever since. And I think the reason is because it's very human. Most of the news is not human. Most of the news that we get these days is conflict in Washington. It's stupid people doing photo ops, thinking that stupid old people, and I'm old, so I could say that, doing photo ops, thinking that shows progress when it doesn't really do anything. And the world and the heartland and the rest of the world is watching and going, wait, these guys aren't doing anything. And just to get off the subject for a sec, that's what Donald Trump tapped into in 2016, was the anger and the frustration over Washington doing its little kabuki plays, and sometimes its big kabuki plays, to no effect, just for PR purposes, and the media going along with it, and now the media with its own agenda. So these kind of human stories are about real people. They actually happened. They have absolutely nothing to do with politics. They're people that you can identify with. I didn't have this photo when I ran the first version for 40 years ago, but they're real people that you can identify as very human. I mean, it's a man with his family, and he wants a better life rather than running a lathe in a British factory somewhere, Kent, I think it was. So he saves up $30. It cost him for three tickets. Three tickets. They get on. It's all very exciting. They sail, and the family gets shattered, and the dream ends. It's the sort of thing, I guess, that the movie tapped into, but a lot of movies do that. I think it appeals to, these days especially, a desire for something that isn't war, that isn't people fighting headlines about barricading and bombarding.
But that is still existential.
Yeah.
But that is still existential. And look, it's not my favorite movie in the world, but it's a really good movie.
Yeah.
It's just there's some manipulations that get into this, where Rose is like apparently transported back 100 years, or 100 years from the early 21st century rather than the early 20th century. And she knows everything in the world. She's kind of a Mary Sue in that, which is a female that has absolutely no flaws, right? And learns nothing and doesn't grow. You see that a lot in Marvel comics these days, like the Marvels and some of their other stuff, which is the reason why it doesn't sell. But that aside, and the whole class argument thing that was going on there too, I mean, it's still a really good movie, and it tells a really good tale. And the reason is because, yes, it's fiction. Yes, they fictionalized this. There was no Rose Dawson or whatever her name was supposed to be in this thing. They're not telling the real story, but they're telling a story that resonates because of people like Frankie, because we know that those things happened on the ship. They happened to other people in other circumstances, but a lot of people said goodbye to family members knowing that they were never going to see them again. Yeah. And we think to ourselves, man, if I was in that situation, how would I react? Would I be John J. Astor and say we are men, we are not giving up, we are not going to take seats that should go to the women. We are going to dress in our finest and go down like gentlemen. Would we do that these days? You know, would we put our child on the lifeboat so that other children could survive, or would we do what was his name, Cal? Grab a kid, say, I'm the only thing she has in the world, and sit in the lifeboat. That's the reason why Titanic is such a really good movie. Even
It's human. It's human. But you know,
those stories.
I think it's one of the things that attracted me to journalism, which is a long time ago. We're talking the late 50s. Was everything in life, when you come down to it, everything in life is a story. And the only thing we have in life at the end are memories. That's the only thing. And we can tell them, we can share them, we can write them, but they're gone. And it's like cherry blossoms in Japan, you know, they love them. They only last a few days, but that's why they love them, because they're here and gone. Like our life. Our lives sometimes seem long. They're not really in the span of time. They're just like an instant. And so my dad used to read me stories or tell me stories when I was a little boy. And so they became the fabric of life. I mean, at the dinner table, you're telling stories. And I guess if you don't have a father, then you don't get father stories. And that affects the children's lives for a long time. But and I could say that as a former single parent. But it's very human stories. You think about it, the people having lunch at work, they're telling a story, something that happened last night. That's a story. And it's sometimes they're true. And sometimes they aren't. This one is true. And
nobody said that the film Titanic was a documentary. It wasn't even based on a true story. I mean, it was fiction, and everybody knew it was fiction. James Cameron.
Yeah. You know, and there's nothing bad. I think I didn't see Avatar, but I think that story, you know, about the being conquered and all that, that's a story that appealed to a lot of people, I guess. And so does the Titanic. They're human stories. And I had some frustration. I'm not complaining, because the New York Times gave me a very good life and subsidized tourism around the world. But there was a struggle. There was a struggle internally in the Times, because my stories were like this. Usually, I had to do the daily crap too, but some of the stories, a lot of these stories, because I built up the reputation, were like this Titanic story. And it was always, oh, here comes another Malcolm human feature. But these are the things that I think people really want. And you can tell online. I mean, I never, you know, in 26 years on the New York Times, I never, ever, commuting, flying, traveling, I never, ever saw anyone reading one of my stories. And in the early 2000s, I realized that my boys, all three of them, had been born, doctored, educated, entertained, traveled, fed, housed by earnings from a newspaper, and not one of them read one. And that's where I started to run into you, when I realized there's something else coming, and I better learn how to do it. And so you were before me, but I was early on compared to some of the others.
Yeah.
And fighting that same struggle on a newspaper that online is the future, and online you can tell stories in ways that you don't in newspaper. Newspaper have had a formula, and everything had to be packaged in that formula, like vacuum sealed beef, chopped beef. It all had to be packaged that way. And then they handed it out to you like it was your daily news medicine. And I wanted to package it differently, and I did. And this was one of the stories and one of my favorites. And throwing out the bottle is another one that I'll be doing, I hope, soon.
Well, we'll talk about that when it comes up. Thank you so much for the backstory on this really fantastic column. As the RMS Titanic sank, a father told his little boy, "See you later," but then ... Now, we don't really have time to get into Andrew's other things, like the Democrats' desperate struggle to retake control of the Supreme Court and Donald Trump's smart move on abortion. I agree with you. Those are both behind the paywall, so you have to be VIP members to get to those. I thought that his move on abortion was smart.
However, I would point out that with the VIP now, it's less than half a Starbucks a month. So, and you support journalism. I mean, you support conservative commentary, which we're under attack, and larger forces are trying to squeeze us out. And the only way we can survive is if people support it, choose to support it.
That's right. You choose. You're not being compelled to. You choose, and that's one of the great things about the marketplace, and that's what we like about the marketplace. Choosing to do this. All right, we got to give him a laugh on the way out here, Andrew.
You go, Ed.
Uh-oh, I go first, huh?
I don't have one.
All right. Okay. Well, then, I've got one then. So one Sunday, in counting the money in the weekly offering, the pastor of a small church found a pink envelope containing $1,000. It happened again the next week. And then again the next week, he was watching and he sees this elderly woman putting in the pink envelope. So this went on for several weeks, right? The pastor keeps noticing it's the same woman. And finally, the pastor says, I can't help but notice that you're giving us $1,000 every week, and I'm concerned. And she says, well, no, you don't need to be concerned. Every week, my son sends me money, and I give some of it to the church. And he goes, well, that's wonderful, but $1,000 is a lot. Are you sure you can afford this? How much does he send you? And she says, well, he sends me $10,000 a week. So, 10%. He goes, wow, he's very successful. What does he do? She says he's a veterinarian. And the pastor says, well, I mean, that's great. Veterinarian, we all need veterinarian. Everybody needs a veterinarian. Every community needs a veterinarian, but I had no idea they made that much money. Where does he practice? And she says, oh, he's got 2 practices. He's got a cat house in Las Vegas and he's got a cat house in Reno.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
That's funny you mentioned that, because you're talking about the unusual stories I did.
Yeah.
Years ago, and people can look this up if they're New York Times subscribers in the archives. Years ago, I did a story on Beverly Harrell, who was a madam at a Nevada cat house, and she was running for the state legislature. And so I went to her cat house. She gave me a T-shirt, and I met some of the ladies, and I wrote a story about, and then I went and talked to the mayor who was running against her about the challenges of running against a madam where it's legal. And she was the most profitable stop for the local Avon lady, and what did she? Oh, and she bought every year. She bought a whole page sponsorship in the high school yearbook. I love it.
Politically, she knew what she was doing, politically speaking.
Oh, absolutely. She wore a big cowboy hat, a little tiny woman. Those are the kind of funny stories that I love.
I'm looking forward to reading that column at Red State.
I should do that. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, you bet. I'll look that up.
All right. Well,
okay. Let's see you.
Until then, Andrew Malcolm, the Prince of Twitter, the Regent of RedState.com. Look him up on Twitter at AHMalcolm. And of course, just go to RedState.com and you can see him here pretty much every week. We do this conversation.
That's right. And next week, too.
Thank you very much. We'll talk then.
All right. Thanks, Ed. See you, everybody.